almost anything. My name is predictably Nelda Schulte, and my online business, neldaschulte.com, helps do-it-yourself landlords with free and really inexpensive resources. And my reason for hosting these programs is because when I bought my first property, I stepped in a lot of financial and legal landmines that I want to help do-it-yourself landlords bypass altogether. And to that end, part of the support that I bring is offering really excellent experts to come and share their expertise with you. And tonight's topic is tenant screening. And I'm joined by an esteemed panel of landlords and tenant screening services. We have Darren Short from Tenant Cube. Welcome, Darren.
Thank you.
We have Bill Biko, the educated landlord. Welcome, Bill. And we have Zach Kilman, Front Lobby.
Hello, everyone.
And then we're going to be joined a little bit later by Gil Donkersgood, who is the former founder of Calgary Dwelling Consultants. So, guys, I'm going to ask this big, broad question, and we'll see who wants to jump in first. What are the tips you could offer for some of the most frequent questions you get asked about pre-screening questions? Like, what is the most frequent landlord question you get asked about pre-screening questions where you can offer landlords some really good tips?
I can jump in there. One of the main questions I get is, what should I be asking in the first place? And when it comes to what should I be asking in the first place, I think the most important thing with pre-screening is to make sure the questions are going to help with your qualification process, right? So two that I have right off the top of my head that I always are going to ask is, number one, will you consent to a credit check? Because I'm always going to be running a credit check on my properties. So that's important. And then also, if they're not going to consent to the credit check, we may just eliminate some red flags right off the bat. And then secondly, I'll also be looking at, do you have reliable and verifiable income? Because I also know that that's something I'm going to be looking at later on. And I'll want to make sure that it's reliable, whether that be something that is a job or some sort of assistance. We want to make sure that income is regular and reliable, and then verifiable through some sort of reference or worker or whoever it may be.
So are those questions you ask people on the phone or over text or email first, or are those questions you ask them in person?
Yeah, those are going to be right at the time of inquiry, because I want to make sure that anybody that I'm talking to is going to at least make it to the point of a showing or an application later on. So I want to get those out of the way right off the bat to ensure that they're going to meet the basic criteria that I'm going to have. And that's going to be one, that I can verify using outside third-party data. And then secondly, that there is going to be reliable and steady income. So those are going to be two right off the bat that I'm going to be looking for.
Great. How about you, Bill? Sorry, Zach. How about you, Zach?
Okay. Do you want to jump in, Zach?
Well, I did, but yeah, I think I like what Darren shared. Those are good ones, and I think what he touched on is important for everyone to realize is that screening starts before even the showing. And so I think, it's really important to put a number of questions actually in the vacancy posting. And, those can be around the aspects that you're looking for, but also the obvious ones, which is, number of people, pets, move-in date, and why are you moving? And I think that landlords find that really helps to filter out those individuals who are going to be the right fit for their property and which ones aren't.
Right. And so the reason we screen is why, Bill? Why do we pre-screen?
Well, I'm still not done with what Darren and Zach were talking about. I agree with everything they were saying, and me too. I put it in my ad. I put in my ads that I'll be doing extensive credit checks and reference checks on everybody. I want to weed these people out. We have to remember our time is valuable, and we don't want to go waste our time showing somebody who's going to be a complete non-fit for our property, especially if you've got a property that's 40, 50 minutes away. Now you're talking 2 or 3 hours of your time. And Granted, you should be batching all your showings when you can, but it depends on your market. Right now in Calgary, which is where I'm at, you can get 20, 40, 50 people for showings, so it's not such an issue. But other places, if you're going to be driving across the city for one showing, they better be a pretty narrowed down, specified person that's going to actually be interested and qualified for your property. So asking the questions that Darren talked about and Zach talked about are key. And one of my favorites is always, when do you need it? Because that's a huge one.
Yeah.
If they're telling you, well, yeah, I'm looking for December, And here we are, early October. It's like, that's awesome. I'm going to have my place filled before then.
Yeah.
But if for some reason I have something in December, I'll hang on to your name, right? You just want to make it all fit with yourself. And as far as screening, one of the things that I teach, some of the people I deal with is it's so much better to stay vacant than to lose all that money on a bad tenant. It can take 2 or 3 months, depending. Well, in Ontario, it can take even longer to get rid of a bad tenant. So you got to be that much more precise with what you're doing. And a vacancy or an eviction can cost $3, $4, $10, $15,000 depending on your locale and what all you have to go through. So I would rather spend 2 or 3 months vacant than taking that shortcut and going, I better put somebody in there just to cover the numbers.
So tell me about pet screening, because I always ask people, how many pets do you have? I don't say, do you have pets? Because when I say to people, do you have pets? They'll say things like, oh, well, I just pet sit on weekends for my ex-girlfriend, or there's this dog that I like to kind of see sometimes, so there might be a couple dogs, or maybe, and I inherited my mother's cat and my brother's 2 dogs. There was one woman who told me that by the time I was actually putting little ticks beside pets when she was talking about all the pets. 7 pets. She said she had her 3 cats, her 2 dogs. She inherited her dead brother's dog. It was her mother's cat. I was like, 7 pets. So I never asked, do you? Because they might not consider those pets their pets, but they're still living with them. And I like to say how many, because then people automatically start answering the number rather than yes or no. Has anyone else had experience with pet people? And what are your pet questions? Or do you ask pet questions? I know in Ontario you can't sign a pet lease. It's not legal, but it is in Alberta. You can have a pet lease.
Yeah,
So,
in BC as well. I agree with you. I think the question of how many pets do you have is better than if you do or not. And perhaps, and what types.
yes.
Because you have to ensure that it's going to fit with the property or not. And they would probably like to know that in advance of showing up, and you say no because they have 7 pets versus yes, it's okay. It helps with their not wasting their time as well.
Yeah. How about you, Darren?
Here in Ontario, we can't discriminate for people who do have pets, but what I'll be looking for is what type of pets do they have. So something that I'll be asking, similar to your question, how many do they have? If they do have pets, I'll be looking at what types of pets are they, whether this is going to be something like a huge dog or a little turtle. There's going to be a lot of differences there. So I'll be looking mostly for the type of pets here in Ontario.
Good stuff. Do you have anything to add to that, Bill, that we haven't mentioned?
Pretty well it. My preference is always to go without pets, but if you have the right tenant and the right pet, it just kind of works.
Yeah. Yeah. So story that I wrote about in my Facebook post, I had gone to see a hairdresser in Edmonton. And when I got out of the elevator, she has her shop in a condo in her house. And when I got there, she said, did you see any posters in the elevator? And I'm like, for what? She said, well, about a snake. I'm like, what? And she said, yeah, one of the tenants had a boa constrictor and it got loose. I said, what? Your condo allows boa constrictors? And she says, no, they don't. So you never really know what people are going to bring into a property, what they consider a nice little pet.
It's wild that you would say that. We must have more boas in Canada than people let on, because when I was growing up, we had a similar situation in the townhouse I grew up in. One of our neighbors came knocking on the door. Same thing. If you've seen a boa constrictor, it's mine. And I had seen that one previously, and they're quite large. How somebody loses those is unbelievable.
I just misplaced it.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I was worried. Because we had a couple of cats at the house, and I said, hopefully don't get in our unit. So.
Oh my God. That would be one thing I would not want to meet up with in a hallway or a corner anywhere else. Absolutely not. Okay, application forms, or no, not applications. Let's walk through the process. So now you're in the actual showing. What kinds of questions do you ask during the showing when you actually see the tenant?
You go ahead, Bill. No, not this time. You're first.
Same questions I asked before with my initial pre-screening interview, but I typically reword them a little bit to see if I get the same answers. just so I can get a feel if somebody forgot what they were telling me and can't keep their story straight, or if I'm getting similar answers to what we heard before. And it's really just the same questions. Zach?
So yes, I do that as well also to see if the differences, if the answers change. But I also ask them, the same type of questions you would ask anyone who you meet for the first time, and sort of with the interest of getting to know the individual, because this is someone who's going to be your customer. They're going to be your tenant. You're going to interact with them, hopefully for many years to come. You want to make sure it's someone who you can, get along with and relate to and deal with problems as they come in an amicable way.
Just to talk on that point, Zach, I deal with a lot of landlords out of the US as well. And that actually has brought suits against people showing properties for discrimination.
Oh, really?
When you ask too many questions that fit outside the boundaries of the property. There was a realtor who was working as a property manager down, I think it was even Philadelphia, and they asked where somebody was from because they had an accent, and they were actually sued for $15,000 for discriminating against them because they didn't get the suite.
Wow.
So you got to be careful if you're in the US.
Interesting.
Yeah, and actually that is a good point, because there are human rights laws. Housing is landlord-tenant laws fit under the human rights, Freedom of Information and Privacy, and also the Human Rights Act. So we're not allowed to discriminate on any of the grounds that could be considered discriminatory for any human rights. So yes, a person does have to be careful. And I have seen some suits, not very often in Canada. We're not as litigious as the US, but I have seen some in Ontario. Welcome, Gil. Gil is here now. Bill, you've lost audio? Or can everyone else hear me or not?
I can hear you.
Yeah, Bill, your audio was kind of fuzzy when I was listening to you talk. It sounded sort of staticky. So maybe you want to log out and then log back in again. Maybe that would help.
How's my audio?
Your audio is good. Welcome, Gil.
Thank you. Sorry I'm late.
That's okay. Glad you're here. We're just talking about what you say in person, what you say over the phone, what kinds of questions you ask over the phone for tenant screening tips. And then we were talking about pet leases. And now we started talking about human rights, because Bill was saying that there were people in the United States, landlords he knew, who got sued they were just trying to be conversant. And they asked somebody where they were from. That person didn't get the suite, and they got sued for discrimination. So yes, you do have to know what the human rights code is and make sure that you're not asking questions that fall outside of that. Do you want to add anything to that, Gil? You're actually quite well versed in human rights code.
Well, for example, you can't ask a person if they have a job, because that could be interpreted as some kind of discrimination. Although you are able to ask the source of income, so it's kind of a catch-22. But yeah, that's one of the questions. For example, if someone was to disclose to you that they made their income from social services because they had some kind of disability, that could be construed, if they didn't get the property, as discrimination against people with disabilities. So yeah, you have to really dance.
Okay, now that's all really good to know, and it's good reminders for those of us who are doing it on a regular basis. You have to watch what you say. And then now we're getting to the actual lease, so the application, or not the lease, the application form. So Bill's just being tricky with us. He's coming in and out here. He's playing coy. Okay, so what happens when you get to the actual application form? What kinds of things must you absolutely know about your potential tenants? Darren, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So to Gil's point, we're going to be looking for income. We may not be asking specifically, do you have a job? But income's going to be important. References are going to be important. Again, like I was talking about earlier, it's just important that the income is there and that it's reliable. And however we have to verify it, whether that be again through a social worker, or an employer, or wherever their income comes from, I'll be looking for those points specifically. And then I'll also be looking for their previous place where they've lived and how long they've lived there. To Zach's point earlier, you may want to ask some of these questions so that you can better understand a little bit about where they're coming from, when they're moving, when they're looking to get into the place, and exactly, is this going to be something that they're ready for, and that you're ready for as well.
Great.
May I speak to that for a moment as well?
Yeah, please do.
So one of our rules was if the person has fairly short tenures in different places, instead of going back one landlord, go back two.
Mm-hmm.
Because the current landlord might be able or willing to say anything just to get rid of the person, whereas the previous landlord will maybe be a bit more honest.
That's a great point.
Another thing that we've done that may be over the top is we'll actually do we'll check the property ownership through the registry to make sure that the person who owns the property that the tenant is claiming owns the property really is the person that owns the property, rather than risk having a fake landlord. Now, this costs money, but less money than trying to evict a tenant. And we have busted at least 2 people for giving us false, like they've given their friends' names instead of the actual owners of the property. And then when we found out who the owner of the property was and we called them, they said, "Oh, stay away from those people at all costs."
Now, there are landlords who go to the courthouse and they check criminal records. Do any of you do that? Or check if there have been any violations or creditors after them?
So, I mean, our screening tool does. Yeah, it does review criminal records and court records to determine if there has been anything of that nature. I've never personally gone to the courthouse to do that, but all the power to individuals who do.
I haven't done it either. Bill, have you done that? Bill's not talking to me.
Maybe his audio's still out on him there.
Yeah, it sounds like it is. That's too bad.
One thing I wanted to share with respect to what Gil said about, which was, I think, kind of the next step in the process, which is calling the references and speaking to them. I agree with him. I've certainly seen that happen as well, where individuals gave it a fake reference. And so to get around that, I think it's important to ask questions that only the actual landlord would know. So it can be as simple, and I've seen this work, as what's the address and the unit number again? And if the person hesitates, it's likely that they're in fact not. But it can go further as well to, asking about the experience and how it went. And then I think the most important question is, would you rent to them again? And, to Bill's point, you have to be careful about what you ask. And so that question is not discriminatory in any way. It's merely a would you or would you not rent to someone?
Mm-hmm.
And, because a lot of people are hesitant to say that they wouldn't, but they typically won't say yes if they wouldn't.
Yes, true. And then the other thing I found when I'd be talking to landlords or employers, I always check employer references. I never check personal references because, I mean, really, if you've got a friend who's giving you reference, of course, they're going to say something good about you. But an employer is kind of more bound by reputation law. They're representing the business as well to give you an honest answer. Now I forgot what I was going to say. There was a point I was going to make here.
Well, there's another point I'd like to make.
Oh, yes. I remember what my point was. After I've asked the question, I have to remind myself to keep quiet and let them do the talking. Don't fill in the blanks for people, because the silence makes people uncomfortable and they'll talk more, and you're going to get a more honest answer, more fleshed out information if you stay very quiet and let them get uncomfortable.
That takes a lot of discipline, and Nelda's very good at that. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I think we're going to see laws coming up about privacy violations, and they're starting to say that, for example, posting a bad tenant's name on a bad tenant's Facebook page could violate certain laws. So this may be a sort of a moving target as far as what's safe and what a landlord can and can't do. So although we're discussing it here, you may not want to tell your tenant, I'm going to research you on Facebook and see what information I can find, because that could potentially lead to legal problems in the future.
No, I mean, I always run social media checks on tenants because all kinds of interesting stuff comes up, but I don't tell them I'm running a social media check. But by the way, HR companies for employees run social media checks. That's standard practice these days. But Zach, Front Lobby does something really good where you can. So Zach, why don't you tell us why people should register for Front Lobby if they are wanting to check tenant references?
Yeah, certainly. So, Gil, you're right about that. And in fact, it's always been illegal to post tenants' information on Facebook pages without their permission. And so, that essentially could amount to a blacklist, which isn't legal in any province or federally. So, conversely, what Front Lobby enables landlords to do in situations like you're describing is they enable the reporting of information to the credit bureaus, so to actual licensed credit bureaus to have it reflected on their credit reports. If in the situation where there's a debt owing as opposed to some other information, which of course would not be on there. So what Front Lobby enables landlords to do is both pull screening reports, so credit reports and background checks, but also, which is unique, is landlord references. So what that looks like is where a landlord has reported to one of the bureaus, then through our platform, you're able to then pull that information from a bureau and determine if the person, what their payment history was with the previous landlords.
That's
and
huge.
You then get that verified landlord's name and email address, so you can contact them and actually ask additional reference questions if you have them.
Which is brilliant. There's that cross-referencing that's happening that's never happened before for landlords. Something that came up at the Ontario Landlords Watch Conference a couple weekends ago that horrified me was a woman who owns a property management business across a big chunk of Ontario. And she said there are social service agencies that are finding out exactly what landlords want to see on application forms. And they're taking their at-risk tenants or their high-risk tenants, and they're modifying their profiles so that the person that's applying for the apartment is not the actual person. You don't have the real identity. You have somebody who's got a good credit rating, good references, but when that tenant gets in, the landlord finds out that they're high risk or at risk. Have any of you experienced that with your properties?
I have not. No.
Not in my experience. I haven't seen that yet. No.
I haven't either, but she said it was happening quite frequently in Ontario and it was working its way around Canada, which absolutely horrified me. So yes, something to be aware of, but I don't even know how you would circumvent that. If you're running a credit check, you're doing references, you're doing your due diligence, and someone's faking it. I mean, how would social service agencies legally be able to do that? I mean, and how would you prove it? I mean, I was just kind of miffed by the whole thing and horrified that is actually happening from government agencies. But she said she saw it quite frequently. But you haven't, so I guess I'll move on to my next question. Credit checks. How do you deal with the whole credit check issue?
Well, maybe this will, kind of answer your last statement or question a little bit. With what we do in regards to credit checks at Tenant Cube is we make sure that when a tenant or an applicant or even a landlord purchases a credit report, it comes directly back to the person running it. So there's no chance for it to be edited or bait and switch or photoshopped or anything like that. We want to make sure that it comes directly to the person who is going to need that information. So that's one way that we make sure that a situation like you've just presented cannot happen.
Mm-hmm. Good stuff. How about you, Zach?
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, credit checks, I think, are essential, but they're not the only thing that matters. And so, I mean, if someone actually has a credit score and has a credit history, you're going to be able to glean some information around their payment responsibility. But where we try and go one layer further is that for someone who is perhaps young, so they're new to credit and don't have a credit score, or someone who's a newcomer to Canada, and so they also may not have a credit score and a credit report, they can still be, in many cases are obviously a fantastic tenant who you want to rent to. And so what we're trying to do is to get that past tenant history into the credit bureaus so that it's into our credit bureau, so that it's then pulled and visible for people who are screening, so they can say, oh, well, even though this individual doesn't have a credit score or a credit report with one of the big bureaus like Equifax, they do in fact have a tenant record. And I can see that they paid on time for all of the months of their past tenancy.
That's really helpful. So what do you do with tenants who don't have a credit record or a credit score? Like, well, let's say you have somebody who's really young. Let's say they're 18 years old. It's their first time away from home. How do you handle that, Darren? And Gil, I'd like to ask you too, and Bill, if he comes back.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I mean, if it's something where if they're really young, perhaps maybe it's their first time out, or maybe they're a group of students, for example. I can't be shy looking for guarantors. So that's definitely an option I'd be looking at for somebody who's brand new. And then again, if there is a situation where perhaps there's no or limited history, I'll really be going the extra mile with all of the other areas we've talked about. So again, with any employment verification, I'm going to be making sure that I really go deeper on the additional information outside of the history. Zach made a really good point. Credit reporting is incredibly helpful, but it's not the be all end all. So anytime where there is a lack of that, I'll be looking at everything else to help paint a fuller picture.
So the other thing we've done, especially for people who may not have established credit or may have damaged credit, and damaged credit does happen to people to good people. You might lose your job, you might have a marriage breakup, that sort of thing. We've had lots of people who said my spouse destroyed my credit during the divorce. But what we'll do is we'll ask them to provide some evidence from a bank. For example, if they're newcomers with money, that they actually have the money that they claim. And this is another case for retired people too, where if a person is retired, they may not have a job or an income, but they may have hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank. Or if a person's had their credit destroyed and they're rebuilding, the bank will be able to give us some indication that that's the case. It's just a way to sort of hedge your bets.
Yeah, and typically people who have, if people have been bankrupt and when I've given out credit reports before, I've said, is there anything you'd like to tell me before I
Yes.
write the report? And if they disclose, that's always a good thing, because sometimes it's good to know what the situation is, and you will find out anyway if you run the report. If they don't disclose, if they go, I had no idea I filed for bankruptcy, or there are 5 creditors after me, well, there's your big red flag right there.
And we've had that.
We have, but I think everyone has. But just because someone's had a bankruptcy doesn't mean they're a bad person or a bad tenant. I've let in a number of people who had filed for bankruptcy, and they were doing everything they humanly could to get back on track again. And I wanted to help them. And they deserved a helping hand. So, and they were fine. They never paid late. They wanted to rebuild their credit. Everything was good with them. But there again, they were willing to do their due diligence and provide statements from the bank manager. We asked for it, and they were willing to provide it. We didn't get any attitude from them. If we start getting attitude, then yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. People can go through bankruptcies or other financial difficulties, and it has no bearing actually necessarily on how they're going to be as your tenant.
No.
And so it's important, in those instances to look elsewhere, as Darren and Gil both said.
So the question,
I also really agreed with the guarantor option. If that's available, makes it much easier.
Yes. So the question we would ask is, when we do a credit check, will we be surprised? And if they answered honestly, then. So, I think a lot of people bank on you not doing the credit check, because a lot of landlords say they will, but they don't.
Mm-hmm.
So people know this, and they try to play the poker game and cross their fingers that you're bluffing.
Mm-hmm.
So the trick is not to bluff.
So what are other landlord tips that you'd like to talk about that I haven't brought up yet? I start with who would like to start?
I mean, I felt like the title of this episode should be, instead of how to do screening, do screening. Do something.
Yes.
I mean, I've got one, and this one served me pretty well, and it actually comes down to exposure. So and this is actually maybe not necessarily to do with screening, but I think it opens you up to screening more. I want to list in multiple places. I don't want to limit myself specifically to Facebook Marketplace or a specific listing site. I want to increase my exposure as much as possible so that I can generate as many leads as possible so that I have a higher probability of attracting the tenant who's going to be the best fit. So I think one part that people often neglect when they're about to do some leasing is that they limit themselves on the potential areas where they may find their tenants. So I think get as much exposure as possible to increase the amount of leads, and then narrow down on the ones that look like they're going to be the best fit.
I agree with you there. I don't know what happened to Zach. We seem to be losing people.
We're dropping them like flies.
We're dropping them like flies here.
Yeah.
Where are places now? This is something that I discovered when I started advertising properties in different locations, is that there were popular spots that tenants looked for properties in different locations, and it really depended on a lot of things. Like just to give you an example, my first property that I bought was in Fort McMurray. I still have it, and at that time, when I lived in Fort McMurray, you would advertise your room for rent or your suite for rent in the paper. And people would look at the paper. It would be published on Wednesdays, and usually by Thursday, your phone would be ringing off the hook.
Mm-hmm.
And then Kijiji came into the picture, and everybody advertised on Kijiji. And then it was Rent Board and Rent Faster, and then it's been Facebook Marketplace the last little while where I found my tenants. But I don't always advertise on Kijiji, but I usually do Rent Board, Rent Faster, Facebook Marketplace, and any other place that I think might be popular, because, like Darren said, you kind of have to spread your net out wide and to get as many leads as you humanly can. And there again, it depends per area.
Well, I can give you a perfect example of that. You just named Rent Faster, and here in Ontario, it hasn't picked up nearly what it has out west. But landlords that I work with and I talk with all the time, they're always saying, "Do you guys support Rent Faster? Can I get through Rent Faster on your site?" And the reason is I think to your point, there's a lot of exposure out in your area, out in Alberta and out in Vancouver, or out in BC rather. So it's going to vary from place to place. And another one is like Kijiji is big here in Ontario, but I've heard in the West Coast it's kind of lost some of its appeal. So I think again, mixing and matching appropriate to your area is definitely going to help.
Where do you advertise mostly in Ontario, Darren?
In Ontario, I mean, it's definitely Facebook Marketplace is the dominant force out here. That being said, I've heard some rumors that Facebook Marketplace might actually be moving away from their rental and real estate listings.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm not sure how long that'll last, but that's definitely a dominant force out here. Kijiji is still pretty big. Rentals.ca gets a lot of action as well. But I think Facebook Marketplace is heads above the others.
Yeah,
our experience with Kijiji here was that you didn't get the quality of application that you got with Rent Faster. I think Nelda would agree with me.
Yeah, we got a lot of tire kickers, but I actually recently I found Facebook Marketplace to be head and shoulders above the rest as well. So
you're out west as well, Gil?
I am.
Okay.
Gil's in BC, yep.
I see. Yeah, I that's again. Whenever I speak to a landlord and they're out BC or Alberta, it's always Rent Faster, and I guess Facebook is starting to take over there as well.
One thing I like about Rent Faster is if it was sort of getting really into the mainstream, they've got great stats, and you don't get that out of any other offering. Like if you want to know average days on market, average or rents this year versus last year, that sort of thing, that information is very easily available.
Yeah, and it's very good. It's good to see the stats, to know what to do, where to go, how to proceed. So I'm going to reiterate what we've talked about so far. We've talked about pre-screening questions, and definitely do pre-screening, because you don't want to be driving down to show somebody a property if they don't fit your qualifications, your criteria. Secondly, you want to ask them pretty much the same things legally that you can ask them and human rights wise that you ask them in your pre-screening. And then thirdly, when they're filling out an application form, you need to be very thorough and make sure that you're asking all the questions that you legally can and that you're doing all of your checks, and then do a credit check. Don't just say you're going to do a credit check, do a credit check. And Front Lobby and Tenant Cube have excellent credit checks that are very reasonably priced if you join their memberships. They're really good. And then check everything. Check references. Check land titles on Landlords. Do Google checks. Do social media checks. Be as thorough as you humanly can. And then you stand a better possibility of having a good tenant or good quality tenant. Now, nothing's 100%. My experience has been, I also used to be on the housing committee of a housing cooperative many years ago. And we had tenants who were excellent tenants for 5-6 years. Unbeknownst to us, the tenants had a drinking problem, fell off the wagon. Their townhouse turned into Party Central. They trashed it. We ended up having to evict them. And the co-op, in one instance, couldn't even get the repairs done because they thought it would cost us so much money to repair the actual townhouse. They just decided to leave it vacant for a couple of years. That's how much damage was done. And that person had been a really good tenant. So, I mean, you can't predict things. Somebody could have an illness, have a drinking problem, a gambling problem could get hold of them. They might go off the rails emotionally because there's been a divorce, death in the family, death of a child. You can't really look in your crystal ball and say, for sure, based on history, this person's going to be 100%. But you definitely mitigate your risks by running tenant screening. So yeah, that's my 2 cents. Are there any parting words you'd like to give us, Darren? I think Zach's trying to join, but he's having technical issues.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
I said Zach's trying to rejoin, but he's having technical issues.
Oh, okay.
He couldn't rejoin because of his technical issues. So it's just us 3 mice here.
Yeah, I mean, with respect to parting words, if you haven't heard of us, Tenant Cube, go check us out. We've got a full screening tool. And what I think is important about today's process is that you have every opportunity, whether it's through somebody like us or somebody else. The tools are out there to help you. So don't rely on the handshake and don't rely on a nice smile as much as we want to. And our gut instinct will sometimes tell us, hey, they seem nice. Like, I want to go with them. Just make sure your decision's backed on data and verifiable information. At the end of the day, those are going to be your best resources. It's always still important to have a conversation and make sure that gut feeling goes along with it, but make sure you're backed up by actual data and verifiable information. Are probably
I love that. I
things
love
that I can't stress enough.
That's brilliant advice. Back it up. Make sure you back everything up.
Exactly.
And how about you, Gil? What's your final word of advice?
A couple words. First, every dollar and every minute you spend doing the verification is money you won't have to spend doing the eviction. And I'm going to quote you on this one, or a quote that you quite often throw out there, which is believe in Allah, but finish it off.
Tie up your camel. Which is basically what Darren said. Do your due diligence. Trust. Yes, you want to trust people. You want to think that all people are good. And there are a lot of really good tenants out there. I've had a lot of good tenants. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do your due diligence. Is that what you were going to say, Gil?
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, I've saved the very biggest question for the last. How can I get my hands on a copy of the Canadian Landlords Handbook by Nelda Schulte?
I'm glad you asked. I was about to.
You can get this on Amazon.ca. So Amazon.ca, the Canadian Landlords Handbook. You can get a Kindle version for $1.43, or you can get this beautiful paperback version for $18. If you like this live session, like us on Facebook. I'm also going to post this video on YouTube and on my Nelda Schulte channel. And if you liked it, remember to subscribe and tell all of your friends. Tell all of your friends about Tenant Cube. I'm going to paste a backlink for Tenant Cube. Tell all of your friends about Front Lobby, because these are really excellent services that can help your landlording in leaps and bounds and save you on efficiencies and time. So excellent services. I'll post their backlinks on my YouTube video as well. And then, of course, if you want free access to landlording and property investing resources, jump on my website, www.neldaschulte.com, and click the green membership button, and babada bing, babada boom, you can be on my membership list. And I'd like to thank our special guests, the one who stayed to the very end, Darren. Your name is Darren Short, but it should be Darren Long tonight. Gil Dockerson, thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to thank Zach Kilman for joining us in an abbreviated version. What he had to say was excellent. And Bill has tons of good information, Bill Bico. He is the Educated Landlord website, and he's got excellent advice as well. So thank you all very much for sharing your expertise and for your generosity and sharing your time as well. And I wish everybody a good night.
Thanks for having us, Nelda.
My
Have
pleasure.
a great night.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.